Okay, everyone, welcome to the RAF Museum in the Midlands. Delighted to be joined by Dr. Thomas Withington today. Tom has done research on the Bomber Command's electronic warfare under Peter Gray. He's published in RUSI as well, and today he's going to talk about the WE-177. Really exciting lecture, so I'm looking forward to it. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know about two lectures we have coming up in the next 2 weeks. One is on the 5th, one is on the 5th of May at the University of Wolverhampton at 5:15 p.m. It's with Dr. David Jordan. He's talking on the Falklands War as a misunderstood war in terms of air power. He's looking at it from a British perspective. You're very welcome to join us. If you do, you might even get a pint afterwards. So, you know, worth doing, particularly if you're in the Midlands. It's also broadcast online. So if you're watching around the world, welcome. Please do tune in for that as well. And then on the 12th of May, if you're in London, we'll be broadcasting from Royal Aeronautical Society with John Peaty, who's going to talk about Balbo and the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, in the interwar period. For those of you who don't know, Balbo is, of course, the term that the RAF uses for big sorties during the Second World War. And we're going to talk about how the Italian Air Force and the Royal Air Force had a certain amount of symmetry and influence on each other during that period. So both fascinating lectures. I hope you can join us either in person, as I say, at the University of Wolverhampton. Do come along on lots of numbers. Currently, Facebook aren't letting us promote that event because it's on the 5th of May and they think we might influence for local elections. So, you know, it might happen. 12th of May at the Aeronautical Society, Hamilton Place. You get a lovely view of Hyde Park Corner and a cup of coffee. So come along if you're in London. But Dom, I'm going to pass over to you. So please take it away.
Han, thanks very much. So first of all, it's great to be here at RAF Cosford today. I last was at this museum when I was 5 years old, my head full of crazy ideas. And I was brought here by my dad and my granddad. And I remember being absolutely enthralled by the very beautiful Avro Lincoln bomber that was the centerpiece of the exhibition at that time, and was told that it was haunted. Apparently, probably still is haunted, I guess. Ghosts tend to hang around with these things. But there was one thing that wasn't in the museum when I visited all those years ago, which was the very lovely pair of WE-177 nuclear training rounds that you can see in the Cold War exhibition hall here. They're just by the Valiant. And at that time, they weren't there for understandable reasons. But the WE-177 is, in fact, going to be the subject of my talk today. So a bigger bang, the untold story of the WE-177. Now, you can see from this picture that we've got Mick Jagger, we've got Keith Richards, we've got all the boys there. And for 2 points, can anyone tell me the connection between the title of my talk and the Rolling Stones? Any takers? You're all Beatles fans, I can tell. So A Bigger Bang was one of their albums, and I thought it was a particularly apt title for what was one of the most powerful nuclear weapons that the RAF had operated. So without further ado, quick look at the agenda for today. So just what was the WE-177? We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the development of the weapon. We'll talk about what it was supposed to do, and finally have a look at its legacy. Well, the WE-177 was actually an umbrella term for a number of nuclear bombs that the RAF and the Royal Navy operated. And to quickly go through these, we had the Alpha, the Bravo, and the Charlie. Now, these were all different in terms of their intended role and their explosive power. So the Alpha had a yield of 0.5 kilotons to 10 kilotons. Now, we'll be using these units quite a lot today. So for those of you not aware of this, a kiloton is equal to 1,000 tons of conventional explosive. As a means of comparison, the Hiroshima bomb Little Boy that dropped on the Japanese city, 6th of August, 1945, that had an explosive power of about 15 kilotons. So we had the 117A, and that had a yield of between 0.5 and 10 kilotons. And then we had the Bravo. This was the kind of the big brother of them, the most powerful. That had about a 450 kiloton yield. And finally, in between, the Goldilocks one, if you like, not too big, not too small, the Charlie, about 190 kilotons. So the rationale for tactical nuclear weapons, well, the WE-177 was considered of sorts a tactical, or let's say a sub-strategic nuclear weapon. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, the terms are contentious, but broadly speaking, A strategic nuclear weapon is ostensibly usually quite large and explosive power, and that is designed to be used against a country's war-making potential. So what does that country need in order to be able to conduct a war and continue that war? Well, it needs a whole raft of things. It needs political leadership, military leadership, it needs industry, it needs infrastructure, it needs an economy, it needs all of these things in order to be able to perform a war. And this really is what strategic weapons actually target. So to give you an idea, in the UK, for instance, strategic weapons would be targeted at places like London, for obvious reasons, with Parliament and government being based there, and also crucially the financial district. If we were to look at somewhere like the West Midlands, you'd have places like, or the Midlands generally rather, you'd have places like Rolls-Royce in Crewe, where the aero engines are built, targeted, maybe even places like Spaghetti Junction as well, big transport hub. Tactical nuclear weapons, on the other hand, they are really targeted against what the enemy is using on the battlefield. So what does it actually need to use in order to continue military operations? Again, there's a whole range of targets at play here: airfields, weapon storage facilities, even concentrations of armor, perhaps choke points where you're trying to channel enemy forces through. The terms are, they're not necessarily exclusive. They do blend together sometimes. And if we had nuclear strategists with us today, they'd be debating this until the cows come home. But by the late 1950s, there is disquiet in the UK defence establishment about the UK's reliance on tactical nuclear weapons. Now, the UK had become a strategic nuclear power in the 1940s. In fact, it had become the world's third nuclear power after the United States and the Soviet Union. And the UK wanted to have an independent nuclear deterrent. The strategic part was independent in terms of the aircraft it was using, which is the famous V-bomber force. Again, we've got some beautiful examples outside in the hall today, and also in terms of the weapons themselves. But the tactical aspect of it was still largely reliant on US supplied tactical nuclear weapons. And this caused a number of problems for the UK quite generally. So one of them was that the UK had security commitments beyond NATO. And the UK was also a member of two other security alliances, which have largely been forgotten about now, but there was CENTO and CETO. And that was the Central Treaty Organization and the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And these were very similar to NATO in many ways. They were a grouping of nations, and they had specific geographical areas that they were concentrated on. CENTO primarily was based in the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, well, as it explains, in Asia. And for the UK, both of these security commitments were very important. And one of the reasons they were very important in CENTO's case was that the UK could exploit, Cyprus could exploit these areas in order to be able to attack the Soviet Union from what was considered the less well-defended southern part of the USSR. And so it needed, alongside its strategic nuclear weapons, it needed tactical nuclear weapons for those areas as well. And also the Royal Navy had some misgivings about US-supplied tactical nukes. Firstly, there were storage considerations on their ships, and then there was the whole issue of having US personnel actually accompanying the weapons on board the vessels. Now, my understanding is with any US-supplied nuclear weapon, and this is still the case with NATO today, that US personnel have to be present, and they are effectively custodians of that weapon. And in order for NATO, for instance, NATO has US nuclear weapons supplied to it. In order for those nuclear weapons to be used by NATO, the US government has to give its permission. And then, if you like, the US personnel act as the dual key, and they authorize that those weapons can then be used. So this was an area of concern for the Royal Navy at the time. So in 1953, the UK government starts looking at having a tactical nuclear capability independent of the United States. And this resulted in the early 1960s with a weapon called Redbeard, which entered service with both the Royal Navy and the RAF. Again, we've got an example of Redbeard outside. It's quite interesting to compare the size of Redbeard and the WE-177s together. Redbeard is a very large weapon in comparison. We've got these very strange code names that are used, Redbeard here. The RAF used to use these things called rainbow codes, by which they would have a color as the prefix, and then they have an object as the suffix. And so they came up with Redbeard. Now, there's some apocryphal stories out there of some of the other code names that were used and how they came about and things. But this was one of many of the less eccentric ones, actually, Redbeard. And how this was divvied up was the Royal Navy got about 30 bombs, and these were deployed on its 5 aircraft carriers at the time. And the RAF got about 70 Redbeards. And in keeping with those security commitments in CENTO and CETO, it deployed those to its bases in Cyprus and Singapore. Here we've got an example of a Redbeard being detonated, 27th of September 1956. And a Redbeard round was detonated in Maralinga, Australia, which is one of the weapons proving grounds the UK had access to. And that had a 15 kiloton yield. And that was approximately equal to the little Boyd bomb dropped on Hiroshima. There's a picture of it there doing its thing. 15 kilotons is still pretty powerful. So compared to the megaton class weapons, a lot less powerful, still gives you an idea of what these things are capable of. But there was a problem, and there's always a problem. And in 1957, by the late 1950s, in fact, Soviet air defenses were starting to advance at a pace of knots. The Soviet Union introduced the SA-2 guideline, as NATO called it. The Soviets called it the S-75 Dvina, and that was a high-altitude surface-to-air missile, and that entered service with the Soviet Air Defense Force. And then in 1959, 2 years later, the MiG-21 Fishbed enters service, one of the most advanced interceptors of its time, and this gave the RAF a major headache. Up to that point, a lot of RAF nuclear policy had been based on the high-altitude delivery of a nuclear weapon, including weapons like Redbeard. But suddenly, the SA-2 come along, the MiG-21 come along, and what this means is that the sanctuary, the high-altitude sanctuary those bombers enjoyed was no longer available to them. In fact, SA-2 could reach out several thousand feet above the Vulcan's flight ceiling, for example. The other problem was that ballistic missile technology was still sort of in its infancy, really. The warheads were lacking the accuracy they have now. They were very big, very powerful, and it was kind of very much a sort of blunt object approach with the ballistic missiles. So fire them against a large target, hope they get vaguely near it, and the explosive power will do the rest. So the high altitude delivery of nuclear weapons was becoming much more dangerous. And also loft bombing, which is a technique that had been used for tactical weapon release, tactical nuclear release. At that point, I believe it was NATO policy, I think, called for a release of about 7,000 feet. Now, for those of you not familiar with loft bombing, it's called many different things: toss bombing, loft bombing, labs, there's all kinds of terms for it. What this effectively involves, it's like an underarm throw. So if you imagine you've got a tennis ball in your hand and you go and throw it, and so your hand is the aircraft, the tennis ball is the bomb. As you release the tennis ball, it follows basically a ballistic arc and then drops onto its target. And this was the process behind loft bombing. And the thought was that an aircraft could go in, head towards its targets, and then pull up, release the bomb, bank away very sharply, both to escape any defenses around the target and also the actual sort of percussive force of the bomb as it exploded. But this was considered, even at heights of around 7,000 feet, the Royal Navy and the RAF still considered this a little bit too risky. And instead, they were looking at delivering a weapon from below 200 feet. So there's massive change of altitude there. In fact, I believe the TSR-2, which was going to be the successor to the V-bombers, I think that was actually configured very much to deliver weapons from these kind of heights, had a state-of-the-art navigation system on board to enable it to do that. So what had to happen? Well, sorry to any hipsters, but they had to get rid of your beard at the end of the day because Redbeard simply could not really do the job anymore. It couldn't be delivered at transonic and supersonic speeds. These aircraft that we were talking about would be coming in very low and very fast. Redbeard simply was not designed for that kind of delivery. It could only be delivered from high altitude or using this loft bombing technique. It was also a very delicate, very temperamental weapon. As I understand, the fissile core had to be loaded before a mission. That took time. It was difficult. This wasn't really conducive to being able to get a nuclear weapon very quickly on an aircraft and get it scrambled and out towards the target on quick reaction alert. And equally, it wasn't conducive to maybe having aircraft sitting on the ramp for several days at 5 minutes, 15 minutes readiness to go to hit targets. And it was also too heavy, 764 kilograms, much bigger than the WE-177s, which were a fraction of this weight. And only really one round per aircraft could be carried. And the RAF was very keen, for instance, to have multiple rounds. Some of the targets it thought we might need to actually come and hit them twice, just because of their level of protection. So in effect, the RAF and the Navy needed something smaller, lighter, more flexible, and more powerful. This was the design brief. And this resulted in Operation Requirement 1176/77. And effectively, this tried to distill all of the different needs of the services. The RAF wanted something with a yield of between 50 kilotons to 300 kilotons. So we can already see it's a lot more powerful than the 15 kiloton weight of the Redbeard. The Royal Navy wanted a nuclear depth charge. They wanted something that they could drop several hundred feet below the waves and detonate this thing with any Soviet submarines nearby just being totally vaporized. And so in the late 1950s, early 1960s, the operation requirement was refined and the code name Red Flag was given. Interestingly, the weapon never seems to be known as Red Flag. It always seems to be known as WE-177. I don't exactly know why that's the case. It's just one of those things. But the idea called for essentially at that point a fix or a weapon with 3 fixed yields of between 50 kilotons and 300 kilotons. So that gave a degree of flexibility of choosing the explosive weight you wanted according to the effect that you wanted to have on the target. And the bomb had to be capable of being delivered from high altitude, despite this becoming an increasingly unsafe place for bombers to be, from loft bombing and also from laydown delivery. So this is just the aircraft flying very low, very straight over the target, releasing the bomb being slowed down by a parachute, landing, exploding, and the aircraft having enough speed and enough time to get out and avoid any damage from the resulting explosion. So there ended up being 3 different weapons, as we saw in the first slide. There was the Alpha, which was the low-yield weapon. That actually came, I think, in 2 flavors. There was the nuclear depth bomb, which is this depth charge, and then there was just a low-yield weapon that the Royal Navy were particularly keen on in order to be able to hit large Soviet surface ships. And then we had the higher-yield Bravos and Charlies. And the forecast development costs were around 370 million in today's money. I've been told that the WE-177 may have been the single most expensive weapon system that the RAF ever acquired. I need to go back and compare that with some of the other development costs, but certainly 370 million is a lot of money, even in today's terms. But development was troubled. And interestingly, it was mostly troubled on the political side and the changing world that the UK found itself in at the time. There were design disagreements. This was one problem. The RAF had misgivings about a gravity bomb. It thought just a normal bomb that you drop from an aircraft, this could be vulnerable to short-range air defenses surrounding a target. Some voices in the RAF suggested Barnes-Wallis's design for a momentum bomb. This is quite an avant-garde idea for its time. If you imagine a normal bomb, but with wings that or surfaces that could pop out after it's dropped. And the idea was that the bomb would effectively act as a glider. This would give it a little bit more distance to get to its target. And I think it also the ability to maneuver as well to a greater or lesser extent. But the problem was that there were concerns about the accuracy of the momentum bomb. And also because you had these additional surfaces, these wings and whatnot on board, there was a concern that that would actually take up more space on weapons bays, etc. And that would result in fewer weapons being able to be carried on the aircraft. A standoff missile was also examined, and in particular, a missile called Martel, which was a television-guided anti-ship missile and anti-radar missile. Again, we've got a lovely example to see here. The missile body for the AS-30 was considered as a possible candidate for a nuclear-armed standoff missile using the WE-177 warhead. That would have resulted in a missile called the AS-33. However, it doesn't appear the design was taken any further, and this idea was rejected. And then geopolitical events started to intervene. Well, in December 1962, a bilateral missile project called Skybolt that the UK and US were working on was cancelled. It was cancelled unilaterally by the American government, and President Kennedy informed Harold Macmillan during a summit in the Caribbean that they're not going to proceed any further with Skybolt. And this left the RAF in a little bit of a pickle. And so the Treasury decided to approve a 2-yield, maximum 10 kiloton weapon as a potential, I suppose you could call it a potential ersatz substitute of some description for Skybolt, although it was a lot less powerful than Skybolt in terms of explosive weight. The interesting thing was that in 1962, I think it was, the UK Treasury, the UK government rather, had actually decided to stop all tactical nuclear weapon development. So that had kind of kiboshed WE-177. And the reason for that aren't exactly clear. At the time, there was a growing anti-nuclear movement in the UK. There was also cost considerations. Nuclear weapons are not cheap to develop by any means. And it's possible that the government at the time just thought this is a way of perhaps clawing back some of the expenditure. But what this forced was, as we'll see, that effectively the UK government had to do a volte-face. And then in July 1969, the Royal Navy effectively became the custodians of the UK's strategic nuclear deterrent, a role that it continues today. And as a result of Skybolt being cancelled, one of the, if you like, the consolation prize for the UK was that the US government made Polaris available to the United Kingdom. And this was also, there was a lot of lobbying by, I think it was Mountbatten at the time, in order for the RAF to have the strategic nuclear deterrent, and that paid off with Polaris. So the cabinet performs a volte-face. It realizes actually it's going to need a tactical nuclear weapon after all. And so it's game on once more. And in April 1963, OR 117677 becomes GDA 15/16 ASR .116/77. Try saying that after a couple of pints of Tanglefoot. And this resulted in the WE-177 as we would know it. And a very feverish and energetic development program then got underway. And this saw actually the development of over 400 inert rounds used for the testing, a total of about 400 tests so far. So ironically, far more of the inert rounds seem to have been produced compared to the actual weapon. And the testing happened all around the country, down in Porton Down, in Wiltshire, in Orford Ness, in Suffolk, up in Scotland. So this thing was put through its paces all over the place. And then finally, in 1966, the WE-177B, that's the most powerful version, this entered service with the RAF. Ironically, the Bravo entered service before the Alpha, but there we go. That's how defense procurement works. And in 2 years or 3 years later, 1969, the WE-177, the boosted fission strike roll version of the weapon, enters service with the Royal Navy. And this, again, was the version that is designed to attack capital Soviet warships. A couple of years later, the nuclear depth bomb, this nuclear armed depth charge, that also enters service with the Royal Navy. And then finally, in 1973, the WE-177 enters service with the RAF. Now, these were all different designs of weapon. We've got boosted fission and the fusion weapon as well up there. Now, we could do a whole series of lectures that you'd probably have to be quite masochistic to attend, talking of what defines a fusion weapon, a boosted fission weapon, all of this kind of stuff. But broadly speaking, it's all about explosive power. So when you had the little boy atomic bomb, in today's terms, that was actually considered quite a simple nuclear device. But things got more complex during the Cold War, to the extent that the atomic bomb, right, became one part of the weapon that would then trigger other reactions, creating a more powerful explosion. So a fusion bomb effectively is a hydrogen bomb. And that would have this atomic weapon as a trigger, and then that would activate a secondary payload, and that would create an incredibly powerful explosion. The boosted fission was a kind of halfway house almost between the hydrogen bomb and the simple atomic bomb. That would have the atom bomb warhead as normal, but when that would explode explode. You'd have gases that were introduced into the reaction, and again, that would increase the power of the explosion. So in total, we reckon about 270 plus, so probably about 272 weapons entered service with the RAF and Royal Navy. Getting an exact figure is actually quite difficult. And also getting the breakdown of who used what is quite difficult. It's possible to get an idea of how many Bravos there were, but the Alphas are more nuanced because they were shared between the RAF and the Royal Navy. And in fact, I think it's at RAF Honington where they had the store of the Alphas, and that was a pool of weapons that I think were then shared out. Obviously, the nuclear depth bomb was restricted exclusively for Navy use. So the weapons were envisaged for a large number of aircraft, but in reality, not all of those aircraft went on to actually fly with the WE-177. For instance, although the TSR-2 was earmarked for it, as we know, the TSR-2 never entered service. Ditto, the Valiant was taken off nuclear duties in the mid-1960s. The Canberra, I think, was earmarked again for the Alpha, but actually had US supplied tactical nukes instead. Also the case for the Nimrod. But as we move towards the later Cold War period from the 70s onwards, it seems that the Alpha and the Charlie did go on pretty much all of the major RAF strike platforms, sans the Canberra, so it's on the Jag, it goes on the Tornado. Both the RAF and the Royal Navy's Buccaneers get it, and that's also the case for the Harrier. It also goes on the helicopters, the anti-submarine helicopters the Royal Navy was using, notably the Wasp, the Wessex, and the Sea King. In fact, the Wasp is an interesting story. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Westland Wasp, but it's a very, very sort of simple early helicopter design. Looks really quite fragile. And they could get one of these bombs on the Wasp, but it had to be slung diagonally underneath the aircraft, and the doors had to be removed. And the observer had to be, so the mission would only be flown by the pilot, be no observer. And this was all to save weight because the weapon was so heavy. So this thing would fly out somewhere in proximity to where they thought a Soviet submarine would be and would drop the bomb and hopefully get out of there. It looked to be a bit of a suicide mission, to be quite honest, but nonetheless, it was cleared for carrying the 177A. The Wessex and the Sea King look a little bit more robust for that mission, I think. So how did it go off? Well, it was quite a safe weapon, actually. It was very difficult to set it off accidentally, which is with nuclear weapons, not something you want happening, really. But there were 134 different fusing options. So you had a whole range of effects you could get with the bomb according to the target you had, whether you wanted to blow it up on the ground, whether you wanted to blow it up in the air, under the sea, you name it. It was very, very versatile. And it could be armed in several ways. So it had this thing called the ground control unit, which was actually on the bomb, on the ground. And this was open. It's like a panel on the side of the weapon. It was actually open with something that looked like a bicycle, of all things. So this would sort of, but each of these kind of bicycle keys, I think, was unique to each weapon. So it could be armed on the ground. You'd open this little panel and you'd have all of these different dials, and you would set the bomb according to what you wanted to do, the altitude you wanted it, or whether it's going to be air burst, whether it's going to be ground burst, all of that kind of thing. But also in the aircraft, you had this thing called the fuse control panel. And in the single seat aircraft, that would be next to the pilot. And in the twin seat and in the crewed aircraft, you'd either have the nav would have it in the back, or the radar operator, I think, on the Vulcan had it. And what you would do is when you're approaching the target, I think you set the weapon to safe initially, and you then dial in what you want to happen in terms of the detonation, all of that kind of thing. And then you set the weapon to live. All of that information, by this point, the bomb is powered up, its batteries are going, all of the information is relayed from the aircraft, the umbilical cord, into the bomb's ready to go, then it's released. And once that happens, sensors within the bomb will actually confirm it's doing what it should be doing. So you'll have speed sensors that will tell that the bomb is in flight and that it is moving. Or alternatively, if you're using it against a submarine, you've got a saltwater sensor which will tell the bomb, okay, that makes sense, I'm in saltwater, I'm where I should be. So that's, if you like, the second safety break that has to close. The first one is the control panels. The second one is the bomb's got a sense that it's doing what it should be doing. And then at this point, to initiate the actual detonation, if you're going to detonate the bomb in the air, you'll have an air burst where the radar will determine the correct altitude of the bomb, and it will say, okay, I'm at the proper altitude, and it will release the trigger and the thing explodes. If it's a ground burst, then you have an impact sensor. As soon as the bomb hits the ground, the impact sensor realizes what's happened, starts the detonation. And then finally, for a subsurface burst, you've got hydrostatic sensors that will actually determine the pressure, water pressure, the depth of the weapon, all of those kind of things, realize, yes, where I should be, bang, and it will explode. And unless those sensors determine those conditions, quite simply, the bomb will not detonate. And this was very important because it avoided any accidental detonation of the weapon and ensured that it was very secure. At the time, I understand there were actually some concerns in the UK about the security standards that the American weapons had at the time. They had these things called permissive action link, which was a new alphanumeric code that was put into the weapon, and then the weapon was ready to go. And there were some concerns over the security standards of that at the time. In fact, speeding on to the end of the Cold War, there was a minor scandal in the US a few years back when it was revealed, I think, that for several months, it may have been, that the default code for a lot of nuclear weapons was simply 4 zeros. So if you type that in, you know, you were ready to go, which is a bit sobering when you think about it. And there's me not being able to get the PIN number on my voicemail worked out, but still. So I've run some simulations, very crude simulations on the explosive power of this weapon. And I've used an online resource called NukeMap. Do any of you know NukeMap at all? No? Okay, well, I'd highly recommend it. It's probably the most macabre thing on the internet, actually, but bizarrely, darkly fascinating. And it's somebody who's actually devised a nuclear weapons effect simulator that you can configure. So you can put the pointer anywhere in the world, and you can determine how powerful you want the weapon to be, the altitude you want it detonated at, and then press the button, and it simulates what will happen. It's particularly good if you've had a bad day at work, if you know your boss's address. But what I did was I ran this through all of the different yields we've got, the WE177. I ran it through NukeMap to see what happened, and it's rather sobering. So I decided to make Ground Zero the Cold War exhibition hall we're in today, because I figure at the end of the day, it's probably me thereafter. So we've set this one at 0.5 kilotons. That's the smallest yield possible with this weapon. And if you detonate that here, effectively, sadly, RAF Cosford is pretty much obliterated. And most of the village is going to have an absolutely torrid time too. And we've got 240 fatalities straight off the bat and 270 people injured. So this is already, and this is 500 tons of explosive, and we're already talking some very serious damage. We've got some more stats on the side there. The crater size, 40 meter diameter with that fireball that is 60 meters across. And we've got heavy damage sustained out to about, 170 meters from the blast. This is the lowest setting. I promise you it only gets worse after this, okay? So now we go up to 10 kilotons. It's not good. And this is 4,000 feet airburst. So I've decided to detonate this thing at 4,000 feet above Cosford rather than just straight on the surface as I did with the previous one. Over 1,000 people killed instantly. Over 2,500 people very badly injured, probably. The fireball is 150 meters across. The crater's still pretty big. And we're also getting into particularly nasty thermal radiation levels here. So people with 3rd-degree burns up to 1.53 kilometers from the epicenter of the blast, so from the ground zero there. And when you're looking at burns levels of 60% above, you're looking at a large number of fatalities with that. And also the people affected by very high doses of radiation up to 1 kilometer from the center of the blast. I would wager when you're looking at levels of destruction like this, already I think with casualty levels like this, most of the hospitals in the West Midlands will be struggling to kind of keep abreast with dealing with something of that magnitude. We're already in kind of national catastrophe level here with this level of explosion. And as I mentioned, it just gets worse. Right, 190 kilotons. So it's the intermediate one now. Decided to go back to doing a ground burst with this. And really, most of the area around Cosford, moving into Codsall, even sort of heading into northwestern Wolverhampton there, are suffering incredibly horrific levels of damage. People will be getting huge doses of radiation up to 2 kilometers out from ground zero. And this kind of cigar shape that you see that is stretching northeast there from the center of the explosion, this is the pattern of the radioactive fallout after the attack. So as you all know, you have a nuclear detonation, you have the iconic mushroom cloud that everyone's aware of. If you're detonating the nuclear bomb on the surface, you're creating this massive crater, and all of the air, all of the dust, the soil, the debris that's in that crater is getting sucked up into this mushroom cloud, where it becomes intensely radioactive once it's there. And then what happens is, over time, that is blown by the prevailing wind out. And this causes the fallout that you'll all have heard about. And this is moving hugely radioactive material across the country. If I could zoom out on this map now, you'd see that this plume of radiation, it actually stretches all the way up to Hull and the Humber estuary there. And the casualty levels don't even bear thinking about. I mean, again, you'd be looking at emergency services being completely overwhelmed by this. This is just one explosion, you know. In a nuclear war, you'd be looking at a number of these things happening. And then we go to the largest explosion of all, 450 kilotons, 4,000 feet airburst I've done with this. This could only be termed a national catastrophe if something like that happened. And you can see the casualty figures just speak for themselves, and the level of destruction will be absolutely complete. And it's very sobering to think that this is by no means, in Cold War terms, this is by no means the most powerful of weapons that were developed. I mean, you had things of several megatons and above that would be infinitely more powerful than this. So this gives you an idea of the actual explosive power that these weapons had. They may have been considered tactical nuclear weapons, but the effect that they would have would be absolutely profound. So the legacy of the weapon, well, ironically, the WE-177 went to war. In 1982, exactly 40 years ago, WE-177 rounds were on the task force that went down to the South Atlantic to liberate the Falkland Islands. And in fact, there were training rounds on pretty much all of the major surface combatants, but there were live rounds, we think, on 4 of the ships, Brilliant and Broadsword, and also the 2 carriers, Hermes and Invincible. And the reason they went down to the South Atlantic was nobody ever envisaged that they would be used in the conflict. But at the time, it was just simply thought it would delay things for too long to try and remove the weapons in port while the task force was being ready, needed to sail at speed. And so instead, the decision was taken to actually remove the weapons as they were heading down to the Falkland Islands. And the weapons were removed and put in the deep weapons magazines of the 2 carriers, and also moved on to some Royal Fleet auxiliaries accompanying the task force. And interestingly, Latin America is a nuclear-free zone. So the territorial waters of Latin America, ships carrying nuclear weapons are not permitted to sail through them. And the UK is a signatory to the treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons going into territorial waters there. And so what happened was, interestingly, at no time did the UK ever violate that treaty, because my understanding is that effectively the carriers and the RFAs remained in international waters during the war. And so the UK was able to keep its treaty obligations despite having these weapons near theatre. But 10 years later, in 1992, geopolitical events change once more, and the Cold War comes to a close. And essentially, WE-177's raison d'etre also comes to a close. And in 1992, Defense Secretary Malcolm Rifkin takes the decision to retire the Alpha from Royal Navy service. The Bravo soldiers on for a few more years. In 1995, it is retired from RAF service. And then finally, in 1998, the WE-177C leaves service. And with that, the tactical nuclear weapons chapter in the RAF closes. And in fact, the RAF's nuclear chapter closes for good. However, this does not mean the end of the tactical nuclear mission. As we mentioned earlier, in the late 1960s, the Royal Navy becomes custodian of the UK strategic nuclear deterrent, something it continues to do today. And it gets initially the Polaris missile, and later it gets the Trident D5, which is the existing missile that it still uses. And this, although it's an American supplied weapons system, the warhead and all the physics and all the stuff that goes bang on the missile is British. And in particular, the warhead, which is known as the Mark IV, the Mark IV-A Holbrook warhead, that has a variable yield of between 80 to 100 kilotons. That's the figure in the public domain. The yields are probably either a little bit smaller or a little bit larger. But so that is roughly a little bit less than the 100 kilotons, a little bit less than what was achievable with the Charlie version of the WE-177. But interestingly, it's also thought that there are lighter warheads on the Trident missiles. So typically in the 10 to 15 kiloton yield range. And the idea behind that is to ensure that the British government has that as a targeted option. So if the UK wants to do a kind of nuclear shot across the bow, if you imagine, perhaps hit a small target or signal intent with a smaller explosion, these lighter warheads give the government the option to do that. And typically it's thought that every Royal Navy Vanguard class submarine that goes out on patrol, typically in its missiles, it has a mix of the warheads. So some will be equipped with these larger warheads, some will be equipped with these lighter warheads. And really that's, again, to give the options, the political options there, should, God forbid, the need arise. So the WE-177 may have left service, is no longer with us, but the actual tactical mission that it was responsible for, that very much continues today. So I'm aware that I've prattled on for almost 40 minutes. So I will rest your ears at this point. And I'd like to say thank you all very much for your attention, and looking forward to any questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed that, Dom.
Thank you.
Fascinating lecture. I've got some questions, but there's a lot which have come in online, but I'm going to throw it open to the room first if there are any questions which people want to pose.
Thank you. Can you explain how the yield of the bombs was changed? I mean, was it one bomb that you could somehow change the yield of, or were they made specifically to set yields?
My understanding, I think, was that I think it was on the Alpha that the yield could be selected, I think, according to the effect that you wanted to have. So on the fuse control panel, we talked about that would be if you would select that before the mission or during the mission. But the Americans, for instance, have a thing called dialer yield, which they had on their weapons, where I think you would actually have a figure that you would physically set it to, if I'm making sense. So you'd have, like, 0.5 kilotons, 1 kiloton, 10 kilotons. I think with the WE-177, it just depended on what effect you wanted to have. So you didn't necessarily get the number, so to speak, but it would be like, okay, if you're going for strike on a surface vessel, or so surface burst against a maritime target, you select that, and then the weapon would automatically program itself to that yield. I think it's all to do with the physics of it, in terms of so as you know, with a nuclear weapon, you will compress the nuclear material and then you get the reaction. But I think it's all to do with with the amount of explosive force you put behind the compression, in terms of how much of that material goes supercritical, basically. I'm not a physicist, so I couldn't tell you exactly. And if I could, I'd be worrying this is the point the special branch come in and sort of ask me to. But I hope that makes sense anyway, vaguely. So I think. Sorry, am I out of shot again? Okay, there we go.
Talk about the Westland Wasp. You just amazed me that fun little runabout can actually carry a nuke. But from your last slide, it was clear that the Type 22 frigates had a nuclear weapon store. Did the Type 21s and Leanders have a nuclear weapon store?
Do you know, that's a very good question. I honestly don't know.
Of course, by the time of 82, the Wasps had left service.
Yeah.
There were no Wasps, so it could have been links on the Type 22s.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I know that in the Navy, I'm sort of trying to fudge it, but I know that in the Navy generally, and this came this came up quite recently, actually. The whole subject of nuclear storage on surface vessels has always been controversial and difficult. And I know that on the carriers, they had very much the proper storage facilities for nukes. And I think I've not been able to find anything, but it would be interesting to know what the arrangements were long term. So was it may have been a case that you were able to store nuclear weapons on board the surface vessels, the cruisers and destroyers, we don't have cruisers anymore, the frigates and destroyers, let's say, for a certain amount of time, but prolonged storage, it was possible on the carriers. In fact, when the UK built the Queen Elizabeth class that obviously they're using now, I found out that at the time, originally it was supposed to be an Anglo-French design. And one of the bones of contention about moving forward on that design was that the French wanted a deep storage for their AMPA nuclear missiles on board the ship. And the Royal Navy had no need for that. And this necessitated quite a bit of redesign of the vessel. And of course, redesign brings costs. That's the problem. And so that was one of the issues that had sort of come to the fore. But I think, yeah, I would imagine it was more the long-term storage was on the carriers and perhaps for a shorter duration. But the WASP is an incredible picture, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of there was an apocryphal story a while ago that when Pakistan developed its nuclear deterrent, in order to some of the top brass realized that having highly secure convoys of vehicles driving around carrying nuclear weapons, with armored vehicles and police outriders, all of this might draw a bit of attention. And instead, why don't we use delivery trucks to move these things around? But then apparently that actually happens. So.
Okay, great. I've got a question online.
Okay.
From Spud. I'm going to ask you first. Why aren't you here, fella? Missing you. He says, would you agree that the nuclear arms agreement signed in 1958 muted the UK in their development of future truly independent weapons and systems?
Spud, that's a really great question. I'm guessing you're referring to the agreement for UK-US nuclear cooperation. It's a really good question because it's a difficult issue. And I mean, I've been quite interested in this for many years because I've lived in France for a long time, and France has an independent nuclear deterrent too. And it's because the UK and France sort of took two different roads. And I think from a cost standpoint, it makes sense with the UK that, okay, well, the physics package we keep, that's sovereign, that's ours, because that's the most secret element, really. And we'll buy in the rest of the stuff from the US. Equally, I understand the French point of view as well. No, it's got to be independent. We're going to do the whole thing. But I think you get into a strategic question here, which is something I've always wondered about with the UK, and I suppose with France as well, is realistically, is there ever going to be a situation where the UK is going to unilaterally use its nuclear deterrent without the US and without the French being involved and without NATO being involved? I can't necessarily see that. Not impossible, but I think it's difficult to see. And I think from that perspective, it probably does make sense to have the collaboration with the Americans, and you get the cost savings with it, and you get the training and all the rest of it. But Spud, it's an excellent question, and I'm not sure where I stand on it, but I appreciate you asking it.
Okay. So we've got a question here from Jeffrey Wardle. Were there any plans to rocket assist WE-177?
There was indeed, yes. There was a putative idea of having it on a missile body. Well, there was first of all the AS-30 initiative that I talked about, which was having it in the body of Martel and doing something with that. But yes, there was this idea. I think it was an anti-submarine capability of having. Now I've got to get this right. I think it was an Australian weapon that was called Ikara, which went on to serve as a conventional anti-submarine weapon. But there was the idea of sticking WE-177 warhead on that and then rocketing this thing out from a ship to wherever the submarine was thought to be and letting it go. In fact, there's pictures of it. It's very weird, kind of Heath Robinson contraption of the thing stuck on the front. So yeah, it was definitely looked at. Yeah.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
How did the Soviets defend against this missile? Obviously, it's quite a big missile with a lot of capability, but surely the defence was equally sustainable, that side.
Well, one of the, yeah, there were concerns. It's a good question because there were concerns about the bomb's vulnerability to air defense, and particularly by the 70s, Soviet short-range air defense gets very good. And in fact, there's a particular, I'm going to sound like I'm digressing, but bear with me because I'll bring us back on topic. But there was a weapon system that the Soviets developed called the ZSU-23-4, which was a tracked, four-barreled anti-aircraft weapon, and it was lethal. And they could use it as it was a very effective land weapon as well, anti-personnel, anti-vehicle weapon. But it was designed to basically fill the air with steel around for a point defense of a target. And it was very rapid fire. It was relatively accurate, but it was kind of scattergun approach, get as many rounds out there as possible. And there was concerns that a bomb could be vulnerable to that. So, if you release this from the aircraft and you've got some good targets, they might just be able to shred this in air. It's a bit like, those things that warships have, have you ever seen that? They call the phalanx, where it just shreds the thing to bits. ZSU-23-4 was thought of being that kind of ilk and that kind of weapon. And in fact, I seem to remember there was some disquiet about the colour that the RAF's bombs were painted. So they were initially painted white, but they're now the ones that are now in this kind of lovely fetching jaguar green. But the white was, I think the white was thought to be particularly bad in terms of an air defender being able to get a bead on it and get rounds on. So yeah, they were worried about this. Yeah. Well, I think the problem with soft kill was that the only electronics on it were the radar for the airburst. So you might be able to jam it. I mean, that would have been, I don't know what the waveband of the radar was, but it's quite, when you look at the nose cone of the bomb, it's quite small. So I'm guessing, antenna's always half or a quarter of what the wavelength is. So I'm guessing it was quite a high waveband radar that they were using. But the problem then is you're going to need to be near it to get enough power into the radar. You've got to hope that the bomb's looking at the jammer. So I think, soft kill is pretty hard, I think. Yeah. Not sure what you could do, really. Yeah, always, definitely. Stop it getting through in the first place, I think, yeah. And you couldn't, it's not like these days, we've been hearing about this in Ukraine with the man-pads, the infrared guided bombs, because it's got no motor, it's just free fall. There's not even a nice heat signature you can aim for. So, yeah, probably the best you could do is try and get gunfire onto it. I wouldn't fancy being tasked with doing that,
Okay, apparently we can't hear the questions online, but they should have turned up, I think. But hopefully they'll have heard that insult directed towards them, because I've just changed the batteries. But if not, Tom, I will ask you to repeat the question, which is...
Yes, of course.
This question comes from Wesley. He says, as part of the testing of the WE-177, as it comes in after the atmospheric test ban, you mentioned the UK sites used, but were the warheads tested as part of underground testing programs in Nevada?
Yes, they were. Yes. Do you need me to repeat the question for our audience online, or? Oh no, you've just said it, haven't you? Okay. The warhead was tested. I think it was in 1960. There was Operation Yucca, or Operation Pampa, was it? One of the two, but it was performed in the Nevada desert in the US, and it was a subterranean nuclear test. Shaft dug down very, very, very far, and the warhead, which became known as Katie, the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment gave very innocuous sounding nicknames to their warhead. So Peter, Simon, Katie, it sounds like a school trip almost. But the Katie warhead was, what became the Katie warhead was tested down in the desert. And there's some pictures of the initial flash, and then you kind of see all the debris on the surface when this thing exploded. And actually, interestingly, I went to have a look on the National Archive website the other day. I went to have a look around. Oh, is there got any data on this test? And it's still classified. It's still under lock and key. So I'm imagining that even today, some of the lessons learned and some of the results from that test may have then also fed not only into the WE-177, but fed into later British warhead design as well. So I think that's might be why it's still under wraps. But yeah, they did test it. So they got an idea of how powerful it would be.
This may be a silly question, but what does WE stand for?
No, I'm a firm believer there's never any silly questions there, but there may be a silly answer. That's a very, I'm assuming it's just abbreviation for weapon, I think. I genuinely don't know. I know it was, they chopped off the part of the suffix of the operational requirements, so the 1176/1177. So whether it just became weapon 177 as a portmanteau of those two, it's possible. But yeah, it's one of the great mysteries of it. And I'm not entirely sure how that came about. What I find interesting is it never got known by the Rainbow Code, because all of the other UK nuclear weapons were, Yellow Sun, Red Beard, Blue Danube, all of these things, and this was the only one which wasn't, which I'm fascinated as to why. It doesn't exactly trip off the tongue easily either. So.
Well, we have a comment from Roy Brocklebank, who thinks it's weapon experimental, which sounds pretty.
Oh, useful. Thank you for that, Roy. Thank you. Good to know.
This question's from Sam Alberti. Hi, Sam. How many, if any, I think we know the answer to this, how many, if any, examples of WE-177 survive in museums, etc.?
It's a very good question. I think quite a few, actually. I don't know the exact figure, but I've got a list somewhere of all of the examples of test rounds and training rounds and all that. I mean, we've got two here. Obviously at Cosford, I think there's one down in the Imperial War Museum. I think there's a couple down at Duxford. I think the Midlands Air Museum in Coventry, one of my favourites, I think they've got a round down there. So yeah, you can go and see them, I think, relatively easily. There's a few of them about. Can I just say, I love the fact that this room feels like a nuclear bunker. It's very atmospheric. Okay.
So it's the difficulty of the Royal Navy accommodating a nuclear sharing program was mentioned, and some of the WE-177s ended up being pulled. After the RAF lost the strategic delivery role and commitments to CETO and CENTO collapsed, was the possibility of giving the Royal Navy a service-specific nuclear weapon while entering into a long-term nuclear sharing arrangement with the US for RAF nuclear delivery capability ever explored?
And you did that all without taking a breath. That's a very good question. The short answer is sadly I've no idea. I simply don't know. Of course, the Navy was getting the strategic deterrent with Polaris, so it was getting the very prestigious one. And in fact, in many ways, the Navy played a blinder actually, because they ended up getting. So the RAF kept this sort of tactical nuclear role, but the Navy ends up keeping a kind of quasi-tactical role and having the strategic role as well. So the lobbying, I think, of Mountbatten and others was done quite well. But unfortunately, I'm not able to give any more information about.
I think it's fair to say Mountbatten was very good at lobbying.
Yes.
So I've got a question here from Jeffrey Wardle. Can you foresee a time when the RAF may have a new nuclear weapon, perhaps the Tempest?
Oh, that's a very good question. Jeffrey, superb question. Thanks for that. In fact, I remember reading a document years back, which was not a government document. It was just a report that somebody like McKinsey or PwC, or one of these big consultancy firms, had done on Eurofighter. And the issue of Eurofighter being equipped with nuclear weapons was discussed in the report. Now, the report was written in the 1990s, and it was basically the paragraph that discussed it said, okay, initially it had been thought about, Cold War's finished, we're not going to need it, no further movement. And that was that. And then I'd heard, I remember chatting to some people in the RAF a while back and saying, would you ever see a time when the RAF has a nuclear role again? And the guys I was speaking to were actually sort of quite set against it and were like, no, it's the cost imperative, and if we have to pay for that, then we've not got money for other things, and all of the other stuff that comes with it. And so there's a bit of pushback from them about the mission. Of course, the issue would be now, as we've seen since February, the security environment in Europe's now completely changed. And obviously the whole issue of tactical nuclear weapons, to an extent, has probably come back on the agenda. NATO retains a large number of US supplied tactical nuclear weapons that are based in Germany, in Belgium, the Netherlands and Italy. Whether the Royal Navy would, the Royal Air Force rather, would go back into the tactical nuclear weapons game is a very pertinent question. And then I think you get into the question of, well, would that be a UK developed nuclear weapon? And if it is, would you simply revisit the WE-177 and perhaps modernize that design? It's a design that's there, it's off the shelf. Would you do that, maybe modernize the design, make it more advanced, whatever it is? Or would you look at perhaps getting US supplied B-61 nuclear weapons, which is a standard NATO nuclear weapon, and having those on the Tempest or the F-35? The F-35 is already configured for that weapon. But then that brings in the whole question of, well, is that an independent, is that part of the independent nuclear deterrent if it's US supplied? Does that then fall under NATO's jurisdiction? In many ways, taking the decision to, I would argue, taking the decision to re-equip the RAF to use nuclear weapons, in some ways triggers more questions than it answers, I think. But it's a very good question. I'm sure it's something people are thinking about. Okay.
So I think there's a few which have come in around decommissioning these weapons. Can you just, what do you know about how they took these weapons out of service? Both, obviously, for different grades of them as well. Was there a different process for the A, which left service earlier, compared to the C, which was high yield?
A lot of this stuff, it seems, with the actual decommissioning is still under wraps, but bits and pieces have entered into the public domain. And I think one of the things I'd heard was that they did try and recycle as much of the weapon as possible. So I think the fissile fuel, for instance, there was even some suggestion that the fissile materials in some of the weapons later formed part of the early Trident warheads and was formed back into the Trident program. And I think things like some of the gases, so things like the tritium gas, the deuterium that was used in the fission weapons, the fusion weapons, that was recycled. So I think as many of the components as they could, they did reuse and they refarmed back into the nuclear deterrent. After all, these are they're incredibly expensive materials. They're difficult to develop. I heard this great story from a guy who worked at Aldermaston, and we were chatting once, and I was, he was talking about his life working at Aldermaston and everything, and he just said, I'll never forget this. He turned around to me and said, one of the problems with uranium, and I just remember thinking, I've never actually been in a conversation where someone's used that as the starting line, but here we go. And he said, one of the problems with uranium is it's incredibly difficult to work with. It's really difficult to machine and everything. Go on. And he said it just has a habit of setting things on fire. It's this pyrophoric quality that just ignite things. So he said it was very, very difficult, but with the real challenge of machining it properly. And in order to get a nuclear work, the machining of the warhead has to be done within these incredibly fine tolerances. You're talking very, very specific engineering, very specific mathematics. So I think this kind of idea that nothing would go to, if you could use something again, you absolutely would, just because of the sheer labor and money and the sort of love and tears you pour into developing these things.
So we had a few questions come in about the difference between the depth charge and the freefall model the RAF used. Were there particular differences beyond the need for the pressure gauges, so that when it's reached a certain depth it will blow? Was the casing different?
I think that's a good question. My recollection was, there were different designs of weapon, and I think that I may be getting this wrong, so apologies if I am, but I think the depth bomb had to flood in some way. I think there was a need. Obviously, you didn't really want it around on the surface. So I think that was one of the design requirements. There was a lot of time and effort expended on ensuring that this thing go down, and also go down at the proper speed. It had to actually sink at a specific rate in order for everything to work as it should do and detonate, because the weapon had timers in it as well. So timers would start running once the weapon had sensed it was in the air, once it sensed it in the water. These timers would start running and realize, okay, I've got this number of seconds. Based on this sink rate, I know I'm going to be at this depth in so many seconds, and then I'll detonate. So yeah, I think there was a lot of very precise mechanical engineering that went into, and essentially it was mechanical engineering as well. You know, we're used to everything being very electronic today, but
I have a question.
go on.
Which is, how did the RAF change its war plans when WE-177 entered into service, particularly when flexible response sort of changes? Is there a drive to change target selection, or does it stay broadly similar?
Well, Harry, you've hit upon the one area that is sort of unanswered here. And one of the things I've been always very keen to learn is, okay, so what were the targets? Where was this weapon going to be dropped? Now, I suspect some of this may be classified for understandable reasons, because the world we find ourselves in now, I'm sure that a lot of the targeting books have probably been dusted off. Some of the targets won't be there anymore, but I'm sure a lot of the stuff in Russia is probably, hang on, we maybe need to look at this again. So some of the targets I think are probably classified, but I also wonder with the WE-177 if a lot of them were simply not briefed. You know, it would be a case of, because you were also looking at using this as a battlefield weapon, if God forbid you'd have had the war in Germany start and the Soviet shock army come across the inner German border, if it would be a case of the guys in the Tornado bases in Germany just going, right, okay, we've got this armored thrust which is moving towards Hamburg at this place. They've got to go through this defile. That's going to be a choke point for them. Right, get a WE-177 on it, make sure they can't access it. So I would expect some of them weren't pre-briefed, you know, that there was not necessarily a target set. But I'm sure for others there were. I mean, there would have been things like airfields, there would have been storage bunkers, that kind of thing. But a lot of it does still appear to be under lock and key, frustratingly.
Just thinking about the nuclear depth bomb, were they all airdropped, or could HMS Compass Rose roll one off the back like in the good old days?
Oh God, yes. No, airdrops, I think. I mean, I do like the thought of them just sort of rolling this thing over the side. I wouldn't want to be on the ship though when they did it, because I think there were sort of distances. There were a lot of presumptions in terms of the depth bomb design about, okay, this is the explosive power we need, but this is the kind of margin we'll allow ourselves for friendly ships to be nearby so that they don't get sort of damaged by the resulting explosion. So yeah, I mean, I think in fact it's funny because you could imagine that being quite a British mission actually. Okay, our chance just rolling off the back, what no problem. But I think yeah, it was very much an air delivered, and hence this Ikara idea of, you know, having it being able to project it some miles from the ship. So yeah.
Which was, were there any plans to replace WE-177 for the RAF when it left service, particularly since we purchased missiles which could have taken the nuclear route?
No, not to my knowledge. I think once 177 went, that was it. And I think if the Cold War had continued, it would have been replaced at some point. But I think a number of factors mitted against the replacement, really. Firstly was just the global events. I mean, the weapon was no longer seen as having a role in the 1990s. And once a weapon doesn't have a role for any service, it becomes a cost center at the end of the day. You know, it's very hard to argue its existence. But I think the other thing that changed was that technology moved on as well. Interestingly, the Trident warhead has this kind of comparatively low explosive power. And part of the reason it does is because the warheads are now so accurate compared to what they were in the past. So you can get much more of a pinpoint effect than you would have been able to in the early days of the Cold War. And then also things like cruise missile technology moved on. So now we've got weapons like the RAF, for instance, got Storm Shadow as its air-launched standoff land attack missile. The US have got the cruise missile, the Tomahawk. RAF, the Royal Navy have got that as well. So I think in terms of being able to get a weapon at distance and being able to hit a target at pinpoint, even with the nuclear payload, the technology's moved on now to enable a missile to do that. And as we move into the realms of hypersonics, I think makes the argument for a gravity nuclear bomb, let's say, weaker. It doesn't remove the argument entirely. And we were talking earlier on about what would happen with Tempest. Let's say we looked at having a nuclear bomb roll now. But I think you've almost at the stage where the mission is there, but the technology to do it is different. I think that's the major thing that's changed.
That's great. Unless we've got a question finally in the room, Ben, I'm going to wrap it up. Say thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks,
Really
Harry.
enjoyed the talk. But all of those watching online, and in fact here as well, you'll notice I'm all on my own. I've done a sterling job, I think I should say.
He has,
You don't
yeah.
need to applaud me, but I would like to say thank you once more to Tom, because I think it's been a fantastic lecture.
Well,
Thank you.
and to you, Harry. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much.